The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar about our Saskatchewan Town Hall. I just wanted to say first and foremost that it's been a really struggling time, I know, for all of you, very stressful, and hopefully that you're managing well under the circumstances. Just wanted to give you a bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about today. We'll just go a bit of some of the economic slides that we've put together as far as the impact on the industry, some of our survey results. Then we'll go over a little bit of an overview of the federal program that have been announced to date as far as relief for the industry, as well as what's happened in Saskatchewan provincially as far as relief is concerned, and then talk a little bit about reopening at the end. And we'll leave some time at the end for your questions, which I'm certainly happy to answer. So without further ado, let's begin with next slide, please. So I think it's important to understand just where we're at and how early actually the COVID impact has been felt by members. And already in the beginning of February, we saw that already we had lower sales. So the fear of COVID already started in February. And of course, in the first 2 weeks of March, even before we had a lot of the emergency measures put into place, we've seen in the first 2 weeks of March a 78% of our respondents saying that their revenues were lower. And of course, not surprisingly, after the state of emergency was announced, we saw 96%, 95% in as far as our members saying that they've reduced sales. So no surprise to you there. Next slide. So, and when we see how much year-over-year change in restaurant sales have taken place, you can see again, the first half of March, we were down about 27% as far as sales are concerned. Second half of March, our members told us their sales were down by 72%. So you can see the impact the social distancing measures that were implemented had on sales. So total March sales were down about 50% based on the year before. And we've also anticipated for the months of April and May that our total sales will be down roughly 80%, and we've communicated that to all governments. Next slide, please. So based on our survey information, we did a couple of surveys so far, and we're going to continue to go out in the field on some survey questions dealing with different aspects of COVID-19. As far as what happened in March, we already understood that roughly half of all operations of members were temporarily closed, and then roughly another 40% were closed down for the in-dining portion, but still offering takeout and delivery. We have roughly already 10% of our members now that are closed due to COVID-19. And of course, it hasn't impacted some people who are seasonal operations who haven't operated yet. So that just gives us an idea of where we're at as far as how the industry is operating and to what capacity. Next slide, please. So now let's get into a bit of a discussion. And I know many of you know all these different programs. There have been a lot. We've been pretty pleased with the federal government's response as far as our concerns are concerned. However, the problem is sometimes they announce something, details come later, and of course we have to do a bunch of tweaks because they're moving so quickly that they obviously can't understand all the gaps. But at least we're pleased that they have been responding to the gaps and trying to fix them. So the first program that you're all very familiar with, I'm sure, is the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, which is a taxable benefit providing $2,000 a month for up to 4 months for workers who lose their income as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And CERB is only available to laid-off employees who do not have work. CERB is not a program available to those who voluntarily leave their job, and CERB is administered by the Canada Revenue Agency to catch fraud. And employees or people must have earned $5,000 in 2019 to be eligible. And as a result of our lobbying efforts as well, we've got them to add that addition so that $1,000 a month can still be earned by employees while still collecting CERB. The program is retroactive to March 15th, and as I mentioned before, a maximum of 16 weeks of payments, and the beneficiaries must let the Canada Revenue Agency know as soon as they are not eligible, and they must have 14 consecutive days without work to be eligible. So that's a summary of that program. Next slide, please. So the next one we'll talk a little bit about is the Canada Emergency Business Account. This is CEBA is basically loans to small businesses to pay operating costs, utilities, insurance, property tax, or debt service. This is 100% funded by the Government of Canada, and it's available to employers with between 20,000 to 1.5 million in total payroll in 2019, and they must be operating as of March 1st, 2020. And this has also been expanded to include 50% of alcohol sales. Financial institutions will provide interest-free loans for up to $40,000 to eligible businesses. And if it's repaid by December 31st, 2020, 25% of that amount will be forgiven. If it's not repaid by December 31st, 2022, the balance will be converted to a 3-year term loan at 5% interest. And I know many of you are accessing that program. Next slide, please. So the next program that we're talking a little bit about is the CDC Loan Guarantee for Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises. And this program provides credit and cash flow loans through various financial institutions and credit unions to small and medium-sized enterprises. Canadian businesses must be financially viable and revenue generating prior to COVID-19 to be eligible. And it allows financial institutions to issue operating credit and cash flow loans for up to $6.25 million to existing clients, with 80% of that guaranteed by EDC. And this money is to be used for operational expenses only. Next slide, please. So the next one, and this is the very controversial one, and I know I've spoken to you a lot about the mechanics of this and how it's going to work, and that's the Canada Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance Program. We're really pleased that the federal government responded to our #1 concern, and that was rent relief. And it's designed to lower rent by 75% for small businesses that have been affected by COVID-19. More details are expected in mid-May. This provides forgivable loans to qualifying commercial property owners to cover 50% rent payments for tenants who are experiencing financial hardship during April, May, and June. Eligible tenants who pay less than $50,000 a month in rent, have temporarily closed, or experienced a 70% drop in pre-COVID revenues are eligible, and landlords will be forgiven if mortgage property owner reduces rent by at least 75% under a rent forgiveness agreement, which includes a no eviction clause. And tenants will still have to pay the remaining 25% of the rent. And in the Q&A, I know there's lots of questions on this. I know I've heard from many of you that it's completely asked backwards, that it should be the tenants getting the money, but we are certainly taking those considerations back to the federal government, and hopefully we can address the gaps in this program. Next slide, please. So the other one that I'm sure many of you look very closely at is the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. This is applicable to businesses with a revenue drop of 30% or more due to COVID-19, and they'll be eligible for the 75% wage subsidy. And the 30% revenue drop is to be compared to the same months in 2019, or an average of January and February 2020 revenues. And you only need to show a 15% decline in revenue for March. January, February 2020 average can be used for new businesses, and wage subsidies will be retroactive to March 15th and in place till October 3rd. The current maximum period of payment is 12 weeks, although we are certainly asking that 12-week period to be extended from June to September as well, or basically double weeks to 24 weeks. And an employee who receives CERB in the wage, and an employee can receive the CERB and the wage subsidy at the same time. Next slide, please. So those are a summary of the federal programs, and as you know, the province of Saskatchewan has also announced a bunch of provincial support, some of them directed at our industry and small businesses generally. Right at the outset of COVID-19, we're really pleased very quickly the government of Saskatchewan approved alcohol sales for takeout and delivery indefinitely. That was announced on the same day as the state of emergency was announced on March 18th. And then the big program as well that you're all aware of, and I'm sure many of you already received payments from this, is the Saskatchewan Small Business Emergency Payment. And this is a one-time grant for small and medium-sized businesses directly affected by COVID-19 health orders. The grants are to be paid based on 15% of monthly sales revenue up to $5,000. And to be eligible, you must have been in business on February 29th, must have experienced lost revenue directly due to the public health order, have less than 500 employees, and plan to reopen once the public health orders are canceled. You also can't receive any other payments from non-government sources. So for example, if you've got an insurance claim that was actually approved, that will not be able to qualify for the payment if you're getting that insurance payment, for example. So you can make applications for this program on or before July 31st, 2020. Next slide, please. So other things that the provincial government has done thus far, and trust me, it's not finished yet. I just had a conversation yesterday with both the economic development and finance ministers in Saskatchewan. Other supports that they've announced so far is a provincial sales tax deferral for 3 months with no interest or penalty, and full payment or payment arrangements must be in place by July 31st to qualify. Also, provincial utilities have deferred their payments for up to 6 months with zero interest or penalty, and also workers' compensation has also deferred their months for 3 months on premiums with no interest or penalty from April to June 30th. And again, on this particular point, we're also advocating that, like Alberta did, that we have some sort of a WCV premium credit or for 2020 dues, or a reduction of those premiums. Next slide, please. And actually, as well, I should mention that we're continuing to work with the government of Saskatchewan, and I will anticipate that within the next few weeks, we'll have more supports that are going to be announced. Moving on to Saskatchewan's reopening plan. As you know, on March 23rd, Saskatchewan became the first province to announce its 5-phase reopening plan. Restaurants can reopen in phase 3, which we understand is likely sometime early in June. All businesses and customers are expected to maintain physical distancing. Restaurants, bars, lounges, food courts, cafeterias, cafes, bistros, and similar facilities are allowed 50% of their regular capacity. Buffet service is not allowed, and that's something certainly we need to address. And also recreations within restaurants and licensed establishments are not allowed, including dance floors, VLTs, pool tables, and other areas where it's not possible to practice safe distancing. So that is the Saskatchewan plan. They also have some detail on their website as far as their rules are concerned, which is playing into what we're talking about in our next slide, is Restaurants Canada's plan. So today, next slide, sending a letter to Premier Moe regarding a bunch of questions we have as far as guidance with respect to the reopening plan. We've given them a synopsis. Today we'll get this done of our best practices guide, and we have a whole list of questions for things that we'd like the government to consider as we move towards that reopening date. We're also going to take this initial guide that we're preparing primarily for government today, which we will submit, and we're going to be preparing a handbook for restaurants with all its protocols and practices to employ when food service operations are allowed to reopen. I should also mention to you today, if you're interested, I just received, which I think is really helpful, and we will get it on our website at some point, and that is a list of PPE suppliers as well as hand sanitizer suppliers in Saskatchewan that you can access to prepare for your reopening when that happens. So that's a quick summary of where we've been as federal relief, provincial relief. We're certainly not done yet, and understand there are some gaps in many of these programs, and some people are falling through the cracks, but we are trying to address those with both the federal and provincial governments all the time. So that's the end of sort of my formal deck of slides, and now I would like to open it up to you to ask any sort of questions that you may have, and apologies if there's any time delays here, but we will get to as many of your questions as we can. So I'm going to leave the floor open to you. I guess before we start, and again, going back to a couple of the two major federal programs, as I mentioned about the wage subsidy, we're really pushing hard, and so far the federal government is open to the idea of extending the wage benefit beyond the June 6th deadline, but we'll stay tuned to see how that progresses. And if it's not just an extension from 12 to 24 weeks, at least allow you to pick the time frame, not from March to June, but maybe June to September for those 12 weeks, because you do have until October to apply for that particular program. So I know we're getting lots of questions on that. And of course, on the rent subsidy piece, the Canadian Emergency Rent, Commercial Rent Assistance Program, you know, we understand that a lot of provinces were a little bit reluctant to sign on to that plan because of the way it's designed. And I certainly know that the government of Saskatchewan, for example, would agree that really this should probably be the other way around, that tenants should be the ones getting the rent relief, not the landlords. I've also heard your concerns about the non-eviction clauses. You know, who's responsible for that? That's something that the province would have to do, but they need legislative authority to do that. So that's problematic. And also just that there's no real obligation on behalf of the landlords to be able to, on behalf of the landlords to participate. So I know there's been some examples where landlords are still putting in their demand letters, pay in 10 days or hand in the keys, pay in full. So we're trying to work on some fixes in that program, and we're somewhat hopeful, as with the case with previous federal government programs that were announced, that we can fix those gaps in that particular program. And I understand that's probably the biggest program that you're considering as you prepare to decide whether or not to reopen or not. So the other sort of questions that I'm hearing from you, just got a few in here, is what sort of other offers do you think, so what sort of things have we asked for other forms of support? I think the government of Saskatchewan, you know, we put forward an idea that we should get some sort of PST relief for a few months, but if it comes to a choice of reducing PST on restaurant meals for a few months, or providing another direct payment to you to help with your operating costs and your liquidity, I think that would be certainly something that is more advantageous to you. We're also asking for full wholesale pricing for all liquor licensees to lower your alcohol costs. But bottom line is, anything the government of Saskatchewan can do to put more money in your pockets to help you with those operating costs would be great. Yeah, and I've got a question here about reopening, as far as how do we ensure that staff are not carrying the virus from one table of guests to the next, and that's you will probably come into play, where you'll probably want to be wearing masks for those staff that are already in close quarters. And once you see our best practices guideline, there's more practical advice and checklists and things that for you to do to prepare your restaurant for reopening. I've got a question here about the CECRA. Why is there a cap at the consolidated level? This takes out multi-unit operators that may employ many people. Again, that's another thing that we're certainly taking into consideration. And again, I would ask you to please keep bringing feedback that we can feed back into the various governments. And with all of these governments, as you may know, on the rent relief program, we advocated a program that has no eviction clause, that was based on a sliding scale of rent, and it was also a much longer duration than 3 months, and also some sort of flexibility when you've got some rent, so you're not at a hard, fast, prescriptive number. So again, we're arguing for more flexibility in that program. I've got a question here about Manitoba, BC, and Ontario offering forms of support that Saskatchewan is not, and could we lobby for that locally? I'm not sure what specifically you're referring to there, but obviously when we are offline, please send me that inquiry again and with more details, and I'd be happy to answer it. As far as what government's looking for, they're certainly very pleased that we've put together this letter as far as our concerns and things that the government should take into consideration as we get close to that reopening plan, and also merging sort of what we've got as a best practices with what the Saskatchewan government has. For example, on reopening, in our discussion with ministers yesterday, we floated the idea, instead of the hard and fast 50% occupancy, could we not, as an alternative to the 50%, provide you with a floor plan that shows that you can practice the safe distancing, all the hygiene standards, etc., with the same level of physical separation, but it may not be exactly 50. So obviously you'd have to remove some tables or not use some tables, but what if you come in at 52% or 54% of your regular capacity? And if you can do a floor plan that way, we're arguing that you should also be able to use that floor plan and continue as an alternative to a hard 50% capacity number. So those are some of the things that we're advocating for on that end. Other questions? So as far as other forms of support, again, another question about what we can anticipate the government of Saskatchewan doing. As you know, they've got the Saskatchewan Business Recovery Task Force, which I'm feeding into all the time. They have meetings every week. And the bottom line, though, and I think this comes from our conversations yesterday, is I think where Saskatchewan's mind is at is how do we simply get money to you to help with your operating costs, because they certainly recognize that it's really difficult for you to pay your operating costs with very limited revenue, or in some cases no revenue at all. So I think that is where their mindset is at. But once again, they're very open to any other suggestions that we have. And if there are any suggestions that you have of things that we haven't already mentioned, for example, WCB premiums we talked a little bit about, and that's something that's under consideration. Happy to hear from you, and we will go from there. But we're certainly nowhere close to being at the end of this. And the other thing that we have to really stress to the government of Saskatchewan, that just because you're open for 50% of capacity does not necessarily mean your sales are going to be 50%. In fact, what I've been hearing from many people is they would be fortunate if they get 30% of their regular sales operating under the conditions that they have. And understandingly as well, as we move forward, takeout and delivery is going to probably remain an important component of your revenue stream until we get to a full reopening schedule, which could be months away. Maximum number of, another question is, what is your thought about the maximum number of guests per table? I think 6 is reasonable. I think we're going to argue that perhaps it should be increased to 10, because that is the same sort of, you don't want groups any larger than 10 or 15 people. So why couldn't you apply that to a restaurant? However, there's going to be some limitations there probably with your floor plan as well, and how you do that with either physical distancing barriers or space between tables. So I would imagine in your floor plans that you're putting together, probably 6 is the number that you should go with as far as a maximum table size. Other questions coming in? Apologies here. Any other sort of things that other governments are doing? Yes. Basically, what the beauty of having a national organization like Restaurants Canada is that you do have best practices, things that other governments are announcing, and we're certainly incorporating what other governments have done. So, for example, the WCB program in Alberta, each province has their own unique provinces. We're really asking the government of Saskatchewan, understanding that they have legislative hurdles here on the piece that Nova Scotia and New Brunswick did to ensure that there's no commercial rent evictions until we figure out a long-term solution. So yes, we are certainly looking at all different jurisdictions, and also in our reopening plan, you'll notice when you see it that we're taking the experience of what's happening with the National Restaurant Association, what's happening in other countries, what other provinces, provincial associations are doing, and we're putting all that into our reopening document, which you will see. That is about it for the questions that I have for you. But once again, oh, sorry. Good question. Employment standards, sorry. Saskatchewan has changed their labor law for 16 weeks that allowed us to lay off employees without paying severance as long as they're back with weeks. We have had discussions on that as well. And what we've heard back is certainly as this goes on for longer, we're making the argument that we'll probably need more time for those temporary layoff periods. And certainly the government of Saskatchewan and the Labour Ministry is certainly looking to that, as other provinces have. We're probably going to have an announcement on that in BC. Alberta has already extended it from 60 to 120 days. So there will likely, as necessary, be some changes to the employment standards regs, as long as they're, with the 16 weeks, is that long enough? We're going to deal with that as we get closer to that period, but I can tell you that Saskatchewan certainly is prepared to look at extending that temporary layoff period longer than the 12 weeks. Sorry, if you want more details on that, we can certainly talk about that offline. Okay, there's another question. Has there been any conversation on relaxing dairy board or chicken quotas? Not that I'm aware of, but that's a very interesting concept that we will certainly, that I'll take back to my federal counterpart, David, who's dealing with the whole supply management issue. And I'll certainly make sure that he is aware of that concern. But to answer your question, no, I'm not aware of anything that we've been doing as far as relaxing dairy board or chicken quota type measures or providing any sort of discounts on that food side of the equation. But certainly understand that, and these are the types of questions, and this is the reason why we're having these town halls, is so that we can hear from you some ideas that we may not have heard from before. That's certainly a new idea, and I just wanted to let you know that we're open to all those things all the time. As you can see on the slide, my restaurantscanada.org email address is there. You can also reach me on Twitter, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with many of you as we continue to work through this towards opening and beyond. I just want to thank you very much for your time today, and please let us know if you found this at all helpful, and certainly I'd love to keep the conversation going with you offline for any of you that have more specific questions or would like to elaborate on the questions that we were answering today. And there may obviously be more questions that we didn't get to on today's webinar. So without any further ado, our half an hour is up. I once again want to thank you for taking part of this, and please stay safe, and best of luck as you continue to struggle through this COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you very much.